Won't you join me in welcoming Dr. Robert Owen Krikorian?
Thank you very much. I have to say I'm not sure how any of you people actually study in this beautiful part of the country, because I'm overwhelmed by how nice it is here. Before I start, I have to give my standard disclaimer as a State Department employee that I am here in my capacity as a lecturer at George Washington University, and the opinions that I express will be my own and not those of the State Department. Now today, as we discuss the Armenian Genocide, it's obviously a vast topic and one that can't be fully dealt with in this short period of time. So what I would like to do is break it into two parts, because I know that the theme is remembrance and resistance. So for the first part of the lecture, what I would like to do is kind of give you an overview of the Armenian Genocide, the context in which it took place, and then move on to show how the historical memory and perceptions of the Armenian Genocide had an impact in Soviet Armenia as they strove for independence when the Soviet Union collapsed, and how the memory of the Armenian Genocide was really an instrumental factor in propelling the Armenians towards independence. To begin trying to understand the Armenian Genocide, we need to put it in the context of the collapse of empires. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire began really in the 18th century, but we'll take the story up to the 19th century with the rise of nationalism among the subject peoples of the Ottoman Empire and among the Turks themselves. In the Armenian case, the Armenians were known as the loyal millet, the loyal community. The millet system in the Ottoman Empire was an ethno-religious community-based organization where the patriarch of the Armenian church spoke on behalf of the Armenian community. And so for many years, the Armenians were considered the most loyal of Ottoman subjects. Now, the Armenians are indigenous to what is today Eastern Anatolia, Eastern Turkey. They're the indigenous inhabitants, and then Turkic nomads came in from Central Asia beginning in about the 11th century and settled on Armenian lands. And when the Ottoman Empire was being formed, it was essentially an Islamic empire, which meant that there were two categories of subjects. There were the Muslim subjects of the empire, and there were the non-Muslim subjects of the empire. And the non-Muslim subjects were second-class subjects in every sense of the word. They had to pay special taxes. They were not allowed to serve in the military. They had other restrictions placed on them. Sometimes, in fact, they even had to wear special clothing. So, Jews, Armenians, Greeks, etc., frequently in different periods were restricted in various ways. So as the 19th century wore on, the Ottomans were engaged in repressing various rebellions in the Balkan states, in the Arab provinces, but Armenia was largely quiescent. But beginning in the middle to the late, say about the 1860s or the 1870s, there was an influx of immigrants into Ottoman Armenia from the North Caucasus, which was part of the Russian Empire. When the Russians took over the North Caucasus, they were the Muslim peoples there. Many of them were either expelled or chose to emigrate to the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottomans settled them in Armenia, in Ottoman Armenia. Now you can imagine the kind of hostility that these people that had been expelled from their homes in the Northern Caucasus, for example, they viewed all Christians in a negative way because they associated Christianity with the Russian Empire. And so when they came and settled in among the Armenians, they took their aggression and their anger out on the Armenians. And the Ottoman government did nothing to stop this kind of activity. In fact, it was even further exacerbated by a policy by the Ottoman government of settling, bringing in Kurdish groups into Armenia as well. And all of this served to dilute the demography of the region. So from a predominantly Armenian region, you then had the Armenians coming into a plurality, and then in some instances in a minority. And one of the other bases for conflict is rooted in the basic lifestyles of the peoples. For example, the Armenians were a sedentary people, but the Kurds were largely nomadic. So what does that mean? That means that when the Kurds had their large flocks, they would trample through Armenian agricultural land, they would destroy as they went along, and then they would be quartered in Armenian villages, which means the Ottoman government gave the right to the Kurds to live in Armenian homes during certain seasons, and the Armenians had to pay for the privilege of having Kurds in their homes, and that also created a fair amount of animosity. Beginning in the late 1880s, early 1890s, as the oppression against the Armenians began to grow considerably, the Armenians became increasingly frustrated, and they were petitioning their leaders in the capital in Constantinople, the Patriarch, their religious leaders, their civic leaders, saying that the condition in eastern Anatolia, in historic Armenia, is growing increasingly impossible. Daily occurrences of rape, looting, pillaging, disrespect, etc. And they said, all we want is good governance. We don't want independence. We don't want autonomy. We want to stop being persecuted. That's our goal. But this is also a time of rising nationalism, and these currents are coming in from Europe, from Russia, etc. And so the Sultan's government is looking very suspiciously at these attempts of the Armenians for better governance. And some Armenians decided to organize compatriotic societies, patriotic societies, and a fledgling revolutionary movement with the thought that peaceful petitions mean nothing, that it's only through force of arms that we can gather our strength and prevent ourselves from being oppressed. And who did the Armenians look to? They looked to the Balkan peoples. They looked to see how the Serbs, the Bulgarians, the Romanians, the Montenegrins, the Albanians, etc., had armed themselves and had won their independence. In fact, at the Congress of Berlin in 1878, where some of these issues were discussed, as the Russians had defeated the Turks in a war and had gotten a very good and favorable settlement, but the European powers, especially Great Britain, were very suspicious of Russian motives, and they forced a reinterpretation of this particular treaty, and they met in Berlin, and many of the Balkan peoples came to present their petitions for greater autonomy and independence, etc. And an Armenian delegation went as well. And this Armenian delegation was led by the Armenian Catholicos, the head of the church. And there was no redress. The delegates at the Congress of Berlin would not even speak to the Armenians. And when the Patriarch, this Krikorian Heilig, a revered figure in Armenian history, came back, he sent out a note, an encyclical, to his flock. And he used an allegory, and he called it the Iron Ladle speech. And he said, at the Congress of Berlin, all of the peoples came from the Balkans, from the Arab countries, the Kurds, the Armenians, came to the Congress of Berlin, and there was made a porridge. In Armenian, this porridge is called herisa. And all of the Balkan peoples dipped in their iron ladles, and they got their portion of the porridge. When the Armenians came to put their ladle in the porridge, their ladle was made of paper. And when it went into the porridge, it disintegrated, and the Armenians got nothing. And that was very clearly a sign that said the iron ladle were weapons. The iron ladle stood for self-defense. And that people only understood, the great powers, the Turkish, the Ottoman government, only understood the language of strength. And you have to understand, as many of you are sociology students, the asymmetrical power relationship between an imperial government and its subject peoples. These subject peoples that do not have the ability to be armed. In many cases, they couldn't even ride horses because it was inconceivable that a Christian would be higher than a Muslim. So they weren't even allowed to do something as basic as that.